Hi, John. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show. You have such a reputation online for being one of the nicest people, so it's really exciting to finally talk to you in person.
I hate this podcast.
Wait, what?
It is super duper awful.
Are you serious? I don't know what to say.
And I think I kind of hate you and Anthony too.
That's really rude. I did not expect that from you.
So, anyway, I don't have any evidence for this at all, but I blame journalists for Red Deck wins, for sure.
So you're saying the Red Aggro deck is fake news?
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Wow. Never meet your heroes, I guess.
Forget you guys.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio, your podcast about Cube and Magic in general. I'm one of your hosts, Andy, and I'm here with our other host, Anthony, caster of Booster Tutor.
I want to do a funny voice, but I can't do that just with my personality. It doesn't work. Booster Tutor is great.
You got a couple of funny voices in you. You've got a Julia Child impression rattling around in there.
I've got a Julia Child. I've got my mom. Wait, those are the same voice.
No, they're not the same. Your mom and Julia Child do not sound the same. I will not have you spreading these lies.
Booster Tutor.
I feel like Julia Child's voice has a lot more of like a kind of Muppety vibe. At least your impression of it, you know?
Man. Why didn't they ever make a Julia Child Muppet? That would have been... I guess that was a Swedish chef. But Booster Tutor, though. Booster Tutor is an excellent Magic card.
I was told by our friend Artless Bread, shout out to Artless, that you cast Booster Tutor 6 times over the course of one match. Can you confirm or deny this accusation?
I don't think I cast it 6 times because I definitely just we did play 3 games, but one of the games was just a dud, as far as I'm concerned at least. I definitely cast it multiple times in multiple games. That is true.
Every time flashback with Kess specifically?
Yes. Turn 5 cast Booster Tutor is a ton of fun. I recommend it if you haven't tried it.
In the one game I saw, you specifically used your first Booster Tutor to get the red mana you needed in order to cast Kess to then cast another Booster Tutor.
Yeah, that worked out really well. Yeah,
I couldn't see your hand in that game, but I'm told that you also desperately needed blue mana, and then along came a blue-red duel for you.
I wouldn't say desperate. Like, I had stuff to do, but it definitely made the hand work a lot better. So if you're not familiar, Booster Tutor is one of these uncards. It's 1 mana. You open up a booster pack and choose a card put in your hand. So it's kind of like a Demonic Tutor or a cantrip where you get the card of your choice, but from like this weird selection. And the way that I play it in my cube is that you're opening up 15 cards, like a booster pack, from the excess cube cards that haven't been drafted. So it ends up playing out really, really well, where you have some opportunities to get fixing or removal spell or a late game bomb. It does have the restriction that, you know, if you're playing it in a black deck, you need to take a black card, so it gets a little bit better when you can actually, when you have the mana to cast all kinds of different things. But it's always played out really well and been really strong, and having cantrips with cast is obviously great.
Yeah, greatest cantrip ever printed, perhaps. Up there with Time Walk in terms of high-powered cantrips.
I don't know about that, but...
Well, we're referring to this draft we did of your cube over the weekend, Anthony, and I think we're going to spend a little bit of time in this episode talking a little more about that draft and maybe how you've digested or processed some of the feedback from that draft. One point I was thinking about is that, it's very interesting that just by the nature of our friend group and the people we sort of play Magic with online, we are very often, we are cube designers and we are having our cube drafted by other cube designers, which is a very different experience, I think, than having it drafted by just normal players, which is maybe something we'll talk about. But also, Anthony, we are welcoming our first ever guest on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. We'll be joined later for a segment by the one and only John from Cultic Cube. He's here to talk about the new series of videos they've been putting out about the data they are analyzing from MTGO, when both he and Gwen from Cube Cobra had their cubes featured on MTGO for a week each. So we're talking with him about that later, so stay tuned for that. But first, Anthony, we got to do our Pack 1 Pick 1. And given that we're going to be talking about your cube a little bit, and given that we have not actually done a Pack 1 Pick 1 from your cube on our own show, I thought we would just do Pack 1 Pick 1 from your regular cube.
All right,
sound good?
Sounds great. I'm nervous. I'm ready.
First in the pack, both chronologically and alphabetically, Audacious Thief.
I like Audacious Thief quite a bit. It's performed a little bit worse than I expected, but that's definitely sort of like where I'm interested in getting the power level at, that a source of card advantage that takes that kind of risk is appealing, but it's not high on my list of first picks.
I'm a little surprised. I mean, I'm always a little surprised when I see this card in and reminded that it was a common. It doesn't feel like the kind of thing you would expect at common.
What set was it in, though?
M20.
Yeah, I agree. That's very surprising.
It's a little surprising to me. Next up is Merchant of the Veil.
Man, the worst part about this segment is we discover how many cards I don't know from my own cube.
This is great. Merchant of the Veil is an adventure, and the adventure is Haggle, which is an instant which lets you discard a card, then draw a card. And then Merchant of the Veil itself is a 3-mana 2/3 that has an activated ability for 2 and a red to discard a card and to draw a card.
Similar, this card is an excellent card in certain archetypes, but not something that's going to really pull me into an archetype.
Yeah, do you see this as just an archetype role player, or do you see this as a card that you'll just play for the value? Get rid of an extra land or whatever, draw, 2 cards essentially, one of them being a 3-mana 2/3 and one of them being whatever card you draw. Like, what is, this is very comparable, I think, to something like, a Thrill of Possibility, discard a card, draw 2. It's just that one of the cards you're drawing is a Merchant of the Veil.
I play it almost exactly like Thrill of Possibility, where it's totally playable. It's not embarrassing to put in any deck, but I definitely prefer to get a little bit of extra synergy out of it.
All right. Next up is a card you've totally browned me with in your battle box. It's Oketra's Monument.
Ooh, this is going to be how this cube goes. This is similar, like it's very strong if you can build around it, but it does take a little bit of a commitment, so it's not something I'm excited to take this early.
This one, theoretically, you don't have to put it in a white deck. It is a colorless card that says whenever you cast a creature spell, do something. But I would need to be casting a lot of creature spells to benefit off of that if I didn't also get the cost reduction from the first line. The white spells cost 1 less to cast. So
right.
I'm basically to see this as a actually pretty high devotion white card. I want to be even more than just like split half and half 2 colors. I want to be leaning heavily white before I'm excited about this card.
I'm a little bit higher on it than you are. Like the combination of the cost reduction and making some tokens in a deck that's half white, I'm pretty happy with it. And there also is my cube is very it's not a combo cube where you're going to be able to do a lot of repetitive loops and stuff like that. But this is one of the few combo-y cards where if you get this in White Mane Lion and some similar cards, you can actually make a bunch of tokens. So there is a high ceiling on this card.
You're definitely right about that. And I should probably, one thing I think I am bad at is, adjusting my evaluations based on the environment. Like, I'll try and consciously think about it a lot, but it's so ingrained in me because of most of the environments I draft that, like, this card doesn't do anything against aggro. Like, I'm not going to take turn 3 off to, like, do something that doesn't immediately affect the board. Like, it's just going to be so bad if I'm getting beat down. And your environment has a less punishing aggro deck, so, engines like this are things that are actually reasonable to get online instead of just fragile traps. So
for sure, yeah, I mean, that's a real
perhaps
challenge.
I'm wrong there. All right, Anthony, continuing the 3 CMC theme, we have Murder.
Ooh. Murder's classic, fine, not great, but I probably would take it above these other cards just because it is always going to make it in every black deck.
Wizards of the Coast, print this at 1 and a black at sorcery speed. Do it, you cowards. Just do it.
They won't do it.
Destroy target creature for 2 mana, 1 and a black. It's fine. It's not a problem. All right. Just so far, what do you want?
Definitely Murder between these, just because it will definitely make it in any deck that is black. So, not super exciting, but fine.
Watcher for Tomorrow is next.
I think I like Watcher a little bit more than Murder. It is a source of card advantage. Similarly, like, I'm happy to put it in any blue deck, even though it's not an extremely powerful card, and it does have upsides with certain synergistic cards.
Yeah, I like this card. I'm always bummed by the fact that it comes into play tapped, which is just part of the hideaway mechanic, because so oftentimes you're like, well, this is fine, I'll like play this and block and get my card back immediately. But when this card was spoiled, there were a lot of people that were extremely high on it and thought it was like a new staple in blue cubes, even of the highest power level. But the two things that really hold it back are coming into play tapped and the fact that you don't get that card until this thing leaves the battlefield, obviously. So it does not cantrip, right? Like, if you top deck this late game, you're going to have to wait, usually, at least up 2 whole turns, because you're not going to get it that turn. You're not going to get it on your opponent's next turn when they attack you, because it'll be tapped, and then the next turn you're not going to get it either. Then the turn after that, maybe if your opponent is attacking you, finally get that card. So it's just really kind of slow. Then we have Chart a Course.
Oh, well, that's my pick.
I think I'm on Chart a Course as well. It is so efficient.
My cube isn't strictly a like pauper peasant cube. It's definitely restricted in power level, and I've even been focusing that a little bit more to try and make sure I'm choosing a lower power level and making sure the card advantage is sort of scaled in a way that makes sense, because a lot of these cards that just generate infinite card advantage and repeatable card advantage can really just take over the game in an embarrassing way. So just an efficient card that actually puts you up is really valuable here.
Yeah, I think I like it too, but I have some other thoughts we'll get to as we get further in the pack.
Okay.
Next up, somewhat similar card, perhaps a Winding Way.
Very cool. It, again, has lots of interesting opportunities for synergy because it can fill up the graveyard, but in a vacuum, pack one, pick one, it is not as strong as Charter Course.
Yeah, Winding Way is another card from Modern Horizons, like Watcher for Tomorrow, that I was ultimately disappointed by. Mostly it's like a 2-mana spell that can whiff when you're trying to draw stuff is just felt so bad to me in my own environment. But
Definitely.
The ceiling is also very high. It can be a 2-mana draw 5 or whatever, right? Top 4. It could be a 2-mana draw 4, so still quite good.
Can and sometimes is. And it feels so
all right.
good.
Fiend Hunter.
This is the hint. Red guy.
No, the Fiend Hunter is 1 white for a 1/3 Banisher.
Oh right,
Priest.
yeah, the Banisher Priest. It's amazing how much I don't read the names of these cards.
It's funny the things that you always read the flavor text, for example. I never do.
I start at the bottom and go up.
Card names are one thing I tend to be pretty okay with. I think you and I are both very good with art. Like, art will always get us
Absolutely,
there.
yes.
We're both very visual people. But yeah, it is funny the different things that stick with people.
For me,
anyway,
it's art and effect, and if there is already a card that does the same thing, that I'm familiar with, I just immediately shortcut to, it is this one. So right. I was introduced to Banisher Priest first. It's now our Banisher Priest. I have that instead of Banisher Priest for the opportunities of doing slightly broken stuff with White Mane Lion. Anyway, I still think it is card advantage, it is removal, but it still doesn't edge out Charter Course for me.
Yeah, and for those curious what kind of broken stuff you're alluding to, Fiend Hunter is of a class of cards like Oblivion Ring, for example, as opposed to Banishing Light, that the enter the battlefield ability and the triggered ability when it leaves the battlefield are written as separate lines of rules text, which means that if you respond to Fiend Hunter's enter the battlefield ability with that trigger on the stack and bounce the Fiend Hunter back to your hand or otherwise get rid of it, then when that first trigger resolves and something becomes exiled, it just stays exiled forever because now there's no Fiend Hunter to leave the battlefield and unexile that permanent. So that is the kind of shenanigans that Anthony likes to get up to. He's a dirty, dirty boy.
Well, I don't think it's so much that it's the kind of shenanigans I like to get up to, but just that it is in a lot of ways a worse design for a lot of environments. But I do appreciate if you have these two things which like don't add so much cognitive complexity when you're just trying to read and comprehend cards, but they add this extra opportunity for this like one weird time I got to do this crazy thing. Like I like to allow those edge cases as long as it isn't really costing anything on the environment.
Okay, so you like a little bit of that, 1 in 100 story equity kind of thing that happens.
Absolutely, yeah.
I still think you're filthy, and you should just, live in that filth and recognize it.
You should try it. It's fun.
In a similar vein, we have Journey to Nowhere, the 2-mana Banishing Light only for creatures that has the same separated lines of rules text.
I do like that. So it's pretty close. Like, I would definitely take Journey over Murder, but I don't think it quite edges out Charter Course.
Okay. Yeah, at this point, I'm still, I think, on Charter Course. Journey and Murder are very similar to me. I actually think I probably prefer Journey slightly.
Okay.
Just because it feels like 90% of the games my opponent is not going to be able to interact with this thing, and so I get to not only get rid of a creature but exile it and do it for 1 less mana, which is good, but more importantly, 1 less Pip of Devotion. It's only 1 white instead of double black,
Definitely.
which I think
It's
makes a bigger
splashable,
difference
yeah.
early on in the draft. I'm curious to know what you think of this card, Anthony. Entrancing Liar.
It's a little bit low on the power level, I'll be honest. I was honestly
That's
just
what I
thinking
think,
in
too.
the last couple days, is it worth... I originally had Icy Manipulator. That felt a little bit oppressive, but I might end up switching back to it.
Yeah. I mean, Liar, for those that are not familiar, is the one that basically works kind of like a Icy Manipulator, except it's cheaper to cast, but you have to pay the power of the creature to activate it instead of just 1 mana to tap it down. And then you have the option of just keeping it tapped down and not untapping the Liar. Yeah, it feels like, you're basically paying a 3-mana tax on top of, it's not a horrible thing to assume that in many scenarios, a creature's power will be almost equivalent to its CMC, maybe slightly lower. it kind of scales up like that. So if you're going to be holding down a 5-drop, you're paying a total of 8 mana to like tap down a 5-drop and not being relevant if the creature has abilities or something. It just feels very narrow to me. So
I do think I like the structure of it and the way that it plays a little bit better than Icy Manipulator, especially because it doesn't interact with lands, which can sort of just be some like weird extreme variants where you just have non-games because your opponent can tap down your whatever land. But the power level is just not really comparable.
Out of curiosity, what to you is the difference between like the small edge of like sometimes you just keep your opponent off of their second color of mana with Icy Manipulator versus the small edge of sometimes you Fiend Hunter and then White Mane Lion and I think gets exiled permanently?
I mean, it's just so much more rare, and like people want to splash, and there are the bounce lands in this environment. I feel like Icy Manipulator can just make a non-game, whereas assembling these two pieces that work together is actually a very satisfying moment.
Okay, makes sense.
And just like losing a creature usually doesn't feel as punishing. It's just my opponent's going to tap my bounce land, and I just don't get to play Magic this game.
Yeah, it is pretty good with the bounce lands, huh?
Yeah.
All right, speaking of lands, we have Indatha Triome. That is the Abzan Triome.
So fixing's definitely important in this context. It doesn't quite do it for me yet. Which one is Indatha? I can't keep these names straight. Abzan. Those are some good ones where you want to splash. How about for you? Does that push out any of these
Yeah,
spells?
this is the pick for me, I think.
Okay.
I still feel like playing slightly greedier. Playing on the slightly greedier side is advantageous in this format, and the tri-lands are great fixing in at the very least like any one of 3 dual color decks, as well as enabling splashes. And honestly, like cycling 3 has proven to be a better rate in this environment too, where like just having a cycling land that's in one of your main colors is also fine. So this feels like it goes in a lot of decks and is by far the most open, flexible pick I can make at this point.
Fair enough.
Then we have 4 cards left. One of them is Reclamation Sage.
It's fine. Things happen. Sometimes you blow up an artifact. There is a lot of the removal in white is enchantment based, so it definitely has applications, but I'm still on either the Triome or Charter Course or Journey.
Mm-hmm.
These are all kind of, I think, a step above.
Yeah, I agree. All right, Dungeon Geists. This is one of the only rares in the pack. It's our first rare. It's our first rare except for Indatha Triome. So we got Dungeon Geists.
Wait, do we do our own comments? So Dungeon Geists is quite good. I think it's a little bit undervalued. A lot of people, when they're approaching this format, it's a lower powered format, but it's not a strictly... What's uncommon? Peasant? I keep mixing them up.
Peasant is uncommon, yes.
It's not a strictly peasant environment, and I think this is one of the rares that I think actually it sort of plays in that space where it's not generating a ton of card advantage, it's not interacting with a bunch of things at once, but it does sort of serve as a 2-for-1. I think it's better than people give it credit for, but I think it is still less scarce of a resource than Charter Course.
Yeah, I think Dungeon Geist is quite good. I don't know how... I haven't heard many other people talk about it or evaluate it, so I'm not sure how other people actually come down on it, but I end up playing it quite a lot in your cube. Maybe it means I take it higher than other people, so I had it in my last draft, for example. And yeah, I think it does a lot of work in this environment. But yeah, double blue, like I don't know what getting past. I feel like I'm still just taking the land here and being pretty happy about it. 2 cards left. See if we can change our minds. Feat of Resistance, Anthony.
Ooh. I love a Feat of Resistance. I enjoy playing with combat tricks. I know it's not for everybody, and I think this is one of the ones that is most appealing, so I'm excited to have recently added to the cube. But I do want the payoffs of just having like a deck full of good creatures before I start drafting combat tricks.
Yeah, I agree completely. And then we have Goblin Crater Maker as the last card in the pack.
Crater Maker. Hey, little guy, you're not for me.
He's very flexible. I honestly put Crater Maker on a similar tier of stuff like Journey to Nowhere and Murder and stuff. It is removal for a small creature or an artifact, and if you don't need that, then it's a 2-mana 2/2, which is a very good rate. But yeah, so I'm on the land. But what is it for you? Is it Charter Chorus?
It's really close. I think that I want to say I'll take Charter Course, but honestly, if I'm opening up the pack in an actual draft, I would not be surprised if I just take the land.
Gotcha. I'm trying to get better at the thing I alluded to earlier, which is like adjusting my card evaluations for different power level environments. And I think one trap I fall into is that in power optimized cubes, or cubes that are like high end on the power level scale, stuff like Chart a Course becomes premium spells, because anything that basically increases the consistency of your deck means that you get to find your other extremely powerful cards more quickly. You like stumble on mana less often. Like all those like little edges that sometimes will not make a huge difference in a low power game, but do make a huge difference when you're playing with some of the most powerful cards, become that much more important. But I'm basically like, I'm running this check on myself now whenever I'm in a lower powered environment, where I'm like, what would I take if this was like a retail draft, or if I was in a sealed pool, which of these cards are you most excited to open? And Chart a Course is not high on that list for me, right? Like if this was my sealed pool, I'd be like, all right, my bombs are Dungeon Geist, Journey to Nowhere, and Murder, and so like those are the colors I'm trying to play. And I would be probably looking to take one of those cards, probably the Dungeon Geist. I think it's like the card that has the biggest potential to have like a significant impact on the game of anything in this pack. Is just, you play a Dungeon Geist, if your opponent can't answer it, now you've got a clock, you tap down their best creature. It's a very sort of powerful card. How does that sit with you? How does that like approach to drafting from a pack from your cube feel like it falls short?
I see what you're saying, but at the same time, the removal is still better, even though people are pretty critical of the removal. It's still better than a limited, like a retail environment.
For sure.
And I think that you're maybe not giving enough credit to the fact that card advantage is really, really important here, and is a relatively scarce resource. So I think a 2-mana draw 2 is extremely powerful.
Okay.
Maybe the biggest thing that turns me away from it is honestly just that people find blue extremely appealing here. In this draft we did recently, I think at least 6 of the players were drafting blue. So
that's not entirely accurate, though, because a lot of the players were just playing 4 or 5 colors. So, like, I was playing blue in the sense
totally
that
true.
I think I had
it
2
was
blue spells
maybe
in my deck.
2 players were sort of playing this, like, 4-color pile. But for the most part, people were relatively focused.
Okay.
But a lot of people were a blue splash with another color base.
Sure. All right. So you're somewhere between land and Chart a Course. I think land is pretty clearly where I want to be, and I'm honestly could be convinced that the premium removal like Murder and Journey to Nowhere is actually maybe even a little higher than Chart a Course. But honestly, like I'm looking at the pack, and I am having a very hard time not thinking like, oh, Chart a Course is a high pick even in my cube, and that's a cube that's more powerful than this one. And that is a sort of trap I'm trying to be conscious of, because I'm so often just saying like, oh yeah, well, that's a card that I'm like thrilled to play in any deck in my cube. But I think this environment is different enough that good removal and bombs could, possibly unseat these very flexible picks, which I think is a testament to the way your environment is designed, right? Like I oftentimes hear people say of powerful cubes like, oh, you never take the win conditions first. Like the win conditions are a dime a dozen. They just always come. It doesn't matter. They're like completely interchangeable. You always just take cheap ramp or, cheap cantrips or mana fixing. That's all you care about taking first. And I feel like that's a pretty big indictment of the design of cubes, where that is actually the correct way to draft them. If your bombs and control finishers and stuff are that plentiful, cut them down. Put less of them in there. Put more cantrips in so that those things are more easy to get multiples of, and you don't have to value them so highly. So
definitely.
Anyway,
I would love for it to be fun and exciting for somebody to draft a Dungeon Geist.
Yeah, I'm. It's right there for me. Like, I think it's entirely possible that like it's just the most powerful card in the pack in terms of like power level, like effect on the game, and maybe is the pick. I'm not entirely convinced, and that's the beauty of Magic, Anthony. We never
It's
know
so hard.
what the truth is. We don't have a time traveling supercomputer. Shout out to limited resources. All right, that's been our Pack 1 Pick 1 this week from Anthony's regular cube. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, you can do that. We will draft your cube on Lucky Paper Radio and do a Pack 1 Pick 1 from your environment, and you can hear us be wrong about your cards. All you have to do is email us at mail@luckypaper.co and include a link to your cube, include how you want to be credited with your name or screen name or whatever, your pronouns, and I will put it in our big spreadsheet, which we will sometimes take breaks from. Sometimes we're going to do our own cubes or, other kinds of cubes that are relevant in the community, but we always got to come back to that well and keep going. So if you sent them in the past, don't worry, a draft of your cube is coming as well. All right, shall we move forward with discussion of our draft on the Sunday, Anthony? How did you digest the, the too many cooks in the kitchen having 7 other cube designers draft your cube and give you feedback on it?
That was definitely a thing. I got some certain kind of feedback. I mean, before even addressing like the kind of feedback that I got, how did your draft go? So you went 2-1, right?
I did go 2-1.
Very respectable.
Yeah, I have to say, and we talked about your cube, and we drafted it, a month ago now, and then talked about a total 5-color pile that kind of like dumpstered us all. And you made some changes to the cube to try and address that. And to be totally honest, I wanted to test the theory that maybe you hadn't gone far enough.
All right, I was wondering if you were going to say that.
And I could just, I'll cop to it. I was like, you know what, I'm not sure that, these changes were substantial enough to change the environment, and I feel like this might still be kind of the right thing to do. So in that draft, I took lands very highly. I took powerful gold cards very highly. It was basically kind of just like lands and bombs that I tried to take.
You had 6 basics?
4.
4 basics?
4 basics, I believe.
Wow.
And a 16-land mana base, 17-land mana base.
Monster.
So yeah, I did draft that deck, and the draft went okay, though honestly, I have to say I didn't wheel as many of like the powerful, committal, like narrow bomby cards as I wanted to. I didn't get as many as I thought I would, so my fixing was very good. I had like a couple of good ramp spells, a couple of enablers. I just really didn't get as much of the like bomby stuff as I felt like I needed for that deck to come together. And it turned out there was one other player that was taking the exact same tact I was. We talked about it after the draft, and this player was like, yes, I was just taking lands and bombs, and happened to get way more of the bomby spells than I did. And there were 2 other players that were in at least 3 colors or splashing kind of aggressively. So there was a lot of players that were kind of hoovering up the powerful gold cards or the things that were slightly off color because they felt like it was the right thing to do. Nevertheless, my deck was okay. I think I did make a couple mistakes in the draft, which I will mention here. One of them is that I pretty early on was taking lands and green creatures, and I had a couple ramp creatures that also fixed for mana, because it also helped me fix for mana, and ramp I think is very good too. Tempo is very good here when you can get a little bit ahead, so that's what I had early. And then I did pass on a Wrath, there's a couple Wraths in your cube, and I think they're very, very powerful cards. And I passed on them because I was like, my deck is mostly creatures right now, and I just feel like I can't squeeze a Wrath in here. And then it was so clear from the way my game is played out that I would have dearly loved a Wrath. It would have been so good in all of my matches to just have a Wrath available to me in my pool. And I just didn't take it because of the creature density I was at. And I feel like I have to remember that in this environment, like just having the information of a potentially symmetrical spell you want to cast eventually is enough of an edge. You don't have to have a deck that's built with like 4 creatures to make a Wrath good. So that was one mistake I made. And then also I gotta say, I did not value Booster Tutor highly enough. I kind of had blinders on with it. I was like, uncard, I don't know. I didn't really think about it, but I could have cast it pretty easily, and I had all 5 colors of mana, so I could have cast any spell I pulled out of the Booster Tutor pack, and I think it would have been... I had a chance to pick that up, but I don't remember what I took instead of it, but it was definitely a mistake. I should have snagged that Booster Tutor, because watching it play out with you in your matches, it was clear it was a very impactful card.
Wow. Have you ever actually played with it?
I have not, no.
I do think it's something that's very hard to evaluate without actually playing with it, because it just, like, there's so many variables, and I'm sure it plays out extremely different in different contexts, but here I think it works very well.
I was just kind of hewing to my heuristic of, like, avoid variance, which is a thing that is just... I'm so naturally like trying to avoid variance all the time, but you get to see 15 cards. Like, you can find some version of whatever it is you need, right? If you need some cheap thing or some kind of thing that resembles removal, or you need some big threat, like there will be something like that in the pack, almost guaranteed. Or at least the chances of it are so high that like the value for only 1 mana is very, very good. So yeah, I had my blinders on with that, and it was a mistake, but I will not make that mistake again. I'm going to value that card pretty highly in this environment, I think, moving forward.
Do you remember some of the specific cards you were hoping to wheel that didn't?
I don't, and actually there was a weird bug on the way we're drafting this, right? I wasn't able to access my draft log, so I can't even check to figure out what it was. Oh, no. But no, it's just basically like, I somewhere like in the middle of pack 2, I was like, all right, I gotta really start prioritizing like 4, 5, 6 mana spells that just like shut the door on my opponent, once I've, stabilized or, gotten ahead. And I struggled to find them. Like I won all of my games were won either because of finality, which is a Wrath, so I did have that in my deck. And actually, it was how well finality performed that made me feel like I really wanted another board wipe in the deck, a true board wipe. So finality, for people who don't know, is the one half of that Golgari split rare from Guilds of Ravnica, and it says, put 2+1/+1 counters on a creature you control, or up to 1 creature you control, and then all creatures get -4/-4 till end of turn. That ended multiple games for me, and the other card I was able to end games with was Krenko Tinstreet Kingpin, who we've talked about on the show before. I was able to, in a couple of games, just get a fast start, get him out, and just kind of bash people with it. My deck was very much like, it was very dependent on my draw. I had some draws that were very aggressive, and I was like, I'm clearly the beatdown here, I'm just going to like go for the throat. And I had some draws where it was like, I got nothing. I'm just going to basically hang back and wait till I draw Finality and, win that way. Yeah, I mean, the games went well. I won 2 of my matches. I felt pretty decisively. In both matches, I felt like I had a pretty good handle on the situation. I did steal one game totally from a player that had, I think, a better deck than me. But they had this big value engine with Soul Herder and Mere Battlesphere, and we're just blinking stuff and making copies of things over and over again. And Finality just totally blew them out. I had Finality just in time before the Soul Herder was too big to die to the Finality, and was able to put a couple counters on a creature, and they just wiped their whole giant board of, like, no joke, like 24 creatures probably, and then just beat them down over a couple turns. So I stole a game there, but otherwise my games went pretty well. And then the match I lost, I got totally trounced. I played against this green-white aggro deck that you ended up facing in the finals, and the draws this person had were just really, really powerful, and it felt like I kind of had no chance. I got blown out in both games by combat tricks, which I really had no opportunity to play around, I felt, because I didn't have much instant speed interaction, and by Rancor. Rancor kind of just ended my day there on the spot in both cases. So, yeah, and then that was kind of how things went. And so I kind of felt like, I felt like I was a little vindicated, or at least my theory kind of paid off. Like, I felt like the deck was good, even though I didn't have the draft go perfectly. I still felt like drafting 4 or 5 colors was rewarding. And then I felt like, okay, well, the person that beat me just has the really good synergy deck, which I kind of always felt like if someone got a really good synergy deck, it would be the best thing at the table. It's just that the inconsistency with which it comes together is the thing that makes me hesitant to go in on those synergies, because if you don't get the right pieces, then your deck can really fall to shambles. Whereas if I'm just drafting, a 3 to 5 color pile, there's always going to be cards I can play. Like, the draft can never go that far off the rails, because even in this draft where I was getting cut by at least one other player with the exact same strategy, didn't matter. We all got playable cards and got to make our deck do something. So that's kind of how I felt. And then watching the finals play out, I don't know which draws are more indicative of what this green-white deck was usually doing, but this person just got much worse draws against you, I have to say. Like, I was watching the finals against you and just thinking, like, man, why couldn't I have those games against this deck?
I mean, do you really think that's the case? I mean, I felt like they were doing their thing, but my deck was just... So I drafted basically a heavy black with a little bit of blue and splashing red deck, and it was just all removal and card advantage.
Oh, I mean, to be clear, I think your deck was a lot better and would have beaten me regardless. Because
we could find out.
We could find out, and I think it would be pretty decisive. I think your deck was better than mine. But yes, this person's draws were very, very bad against you, I have to say. Like, they got flooded in both games and didn't have early creatures to play, and certainly the fact that you had removal made that once you got it to turn 4 or 5, they didn't really have a chance of getting any damage in. Right. But the games were over pretty quickly, because if they didn't get ahead early, then you could shut the door pretty resoundingly. Against me, this person happened to be a pelt collector on both games on turn 1, and then turn 2 either combat trick or rancor to get through my blocker. I got totally blown out by a feat of resistance on my sideboard adorned pouncer I had brought in because it had first strike against their aggressive deck, and then it just got blown up by feat of resistance, and there was no looking back from there. It was just kind of all downhill. So yeah, those draws against you, I'm not sure what would have happened, but your deck was really good. So tell people what you drafted.
Even before talking about what cards I drafted, I have been trying to do a much better job of switching hats when I'm thinking about Magic, where if I'm designing a cube, I will try and think about the environment as a game designer and try and think about what's fun, what's the thing that I want to optimize and the thing that I want to make good, so that people who are trying to play to win will do the fun thing.
Put on your drive to work hat.
Exactly. Versus when I'm playing the games, to not give myself too much credit and just say well, I know there's a great, Boros heroic deck here, so I'm just gonna, try and get all these cute pieces that work together. And I think I did do a good job of putting on my player hat and saying, let's ignore that, let's try and figure out what's open, let's try and draft, the cards that I think are actually the best in this environment. And I also just got extremely lucky because no one else at the table was drafting black.
Well, again,
so, some kind of...
I had black spells. You can't have it both ways, Anthony. If you're going to say 6 people were drafting blue, I was also drafting black.
Well...
So was the other drafter that was playing 5 colors. We both had black spells.
What was your black spell?
I had 3 or 4.
Oh, Finality.
I had Finality. I had the Reach, Death Touch, Golgari person. I don't think I had any mono black cards, to your point, but That was another mistake. I think I should have taken Archfiend of Ifnir when I had the chance, because, again, I ended up light on those kind of big finishers, and I would have liked to have the Archfiend the way my draft ended up. But anyway, I didn't mean to derail you. You did find the open lane, and you got a sort of very good, like, control deck, right? It was just full-on, like, blue-black control with a little bit of a red splash. Was the red splash just for Kess? Did you have something else in the deck?
It was just for Kess. Technically, I had Bedeck Bedazzle, which is another one of these hybrid/gold cards, but the idea of casting Bedazzle is kind of outlandish. It's just a 2-mana removal spell.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so the whole structure of the deck, I mean, I honestly, I did end up taking lands for a couple of the first picks, followed by some of the good black removal, and then I think I got a 5th pick, Archfiend of Ifnir, and felt like, here we go. Like, I think that's honestly one of the best cards in the cube. It's something that I've been really worried about for a while, but players just don't value it that highly and don't end up playing it. But I certainly will. So I got the Archfiend of Ifnir. I ended up staying mostly black. I took a couple blue cards because they definitely do enable the Archfiend, and they generally enable just the control strategy because a bunch of removal and then a couple draw spells ends up working pretty well. And then I also got pretty late in packs 2 and 3 Traxos, which is the 4-mana 7/7 trample, but it enters tapped and doesn't untap unless you cast a artifact legend or saga. And cast Dissident Mage, which lets you cast instant sorceries from your graveyard. So removal, card draw, and then a couple of these like insane card advantage engines ended up working out really, really well. Like, so some of the curves of like Traxos into Eldest Reborn were just really, really hard to come back from.
Yeah, I had forgotten that sagas were historic until I saw you make that curve, and I was like, uh-oh. Seems good.
Traxos also very, like, maybe the best Baneslayer.
What, Traxos is?
Yeah.
Traxos is very, very good if you can make it work. I mean, that was kind of my... I think your cube is approaching... I mean, I think with every change, your cube better sort of personifies your goals, because you continue to make it better and closer to the environment you've sort of stated that you're trying to craft, which I hope is true for everybody who's working on their cubes out there. And this was a draft where I felt like your deck had this perfect balance of generically good cards that meant that your deck was never going to like fall flat on its ass, right, and just not do anything, but also enough synergies that you were rewarded and had better late game, better sort of value and stuff than your opponents could put together, because you did have, you know, stuff like Traxos, which you were reliably untapping enough times to attack for lethal, turning into this like very efficient threat, which felt like it was kind of what you want this cube to be about, right?
Definitely. I mean, I really honestly enjoy the actual draft experience, and that drives a lot of my decisions about what kinds of cards I like to include. Because it's a ton of fun to say, like, well, I have this Traxos, and now here's, like, the choice between two cards that are pretty similar. I actually want to adjust my choice slightly and lean to something that interacts with Traxos.
I'll take the Executioner's Capsule instead of the Murder, or whatever.
Exactly. And so when it can become not the difference between, like, I am doing the all-in artifact deck, I have to take only artifacts, everything else is, like, I'm ignoring and I'm just on rails, but instead, like, things just change a little bit, and I'm in this interesting gray area where I can try and optimize a couple different aspects of sort of synergistic aspects of my deck. I find that a lot of fun.
And I think it's a flaw in my drafting that it's a hole I have to patch, because it's an environment that leans into a bunch of things that are naturally scary for me about Magic. Like, I don't want to take a card that I might not be able to untap in some games and just, you know, play a 4-mana do nothing. So I have to like figure out how to get over that, because in my seat, you know, I mentioned that the thing that keeps me from committing to these synergy decks is the fear that, like, if I misread a signal or whatever, that I'll just end up with a deck that is super inconsistent or can't come together. But it turned out at my seat in this particular draft, my deck was, again, I did have cards, spells of all 5 colors, but I was mostly Naya, mostly green, red, and white, and if I had gone back in time and could give myself one tip on that Sunday afternoon, it would be just play Boros aggro. Just commit to it, because nobody else on the table was touching those cards. The green-white player, I think, only moved into those white sort of aggressive cards because 2/3 of the way through the draft, no one was taking them. I was getting all those super aggressive cards late, and I think I could have had a very good, you know, Boros heroic deck with the synergies that you want that sort of deck to have at my seat. I just didn't have my draft sensibilities are not tuned to being able to successfully draft that deck. So I have to just, like, you know, kind of get out of my own head and just be like, take the cards that are good and, you know, do what this environment is trying to get you to do.
Pro tip, the Boros heroic deck is always open.
So far, it seems that way. And when you have a disgusting curve out with one of those aggressive decks, like that green-white one, again, like it's very difficult to come back because I think the other decks are competing in this, space where they're trying to have the value engine that generates the most value or whatever. Like, what was so good about your deck is that I felt like in a long game, your deck was going to win against every other deck at the table. Maybe with the exception of the other 5-color deck, which had so many, like, blink and, like, other kinds of synergies going on. You two would have, like, dueling, like, value engines you'd have to kind of, like, suss out. But
I like the sound of that.
Yeah, but those are exactly the kind of decks that, like, a really fast start just kind of laughs at, right? It's like, haha, now you die because you can't beat a Pelt Collector into a Feat of Persistence, which is what I died to. I want to talk a little bit about combat tricks, Anthony.
Let's do it.
We've talked about them at length before, and if I could summarize our previous conversations about them, it's that I tend to not like them, and you tend to enjoy them and like them when they're present in a format. And I keep coming back to my feelings about combat tricks because they're not super consistent, right? I mean, in some ways they are. People that have listened to this podcast know that I really like flexibility in my spells. I really like consistency. And, combat tricks are an entire category of cards that are either often uncastable. If you have no creatures in play, they literally do nothing. Or they are very risky to cast because they're the kinds of spells that if your opponent does have an instant speed removal spell or bounce spell or whatever, you are just walking right into a 2-for-1 that you set up for yourself. You made your own table of your own 2-for-1 and you're going to sort of have to eat that. That said, combat tricks are also inherently, almost all of them, some of the most modal cards that exist, right? Because they can say, well, in this situation, you destroy a creature because they made a block, and now you can make your creature bigger than they expected and kill that creature. So now it's a removal spell. And they can be a burn spell that goes right to the face, right? If you go late or, something, you have an attacker that gets by or a flyer, you can use a, pump spell to deal the last couple of damage of lethal. They can fizzle removal spells if they're damage-based or toughness-based by increasing sort of a creature's power or toughness and making them immune to whatever kind of removal that are being pointed at it. Like, they are in some ways the most flexible and versatile cards, and I still just don't know where I land with them. And so can you talk through a little bit about what it is you like about combat tricks and why you like including them in this environment? I feel like one of the big things about powering this environment down for you was that you wanted to play combat tricks, and you're like, I need to have an environment where those are viable.
I mean, it's exactly what you just described. It's that those edge cases, those times where you get to use a spell in a different way or plan out your turns in a way that you can keep up a combat trick that might foil certain kinds of removal, are just, to me, some of the most enjoyable parts of the game. So, yeah, why not? And I mean, a lot of times people will talk about Cube, especially when you're talking about a high-powered Vintage or Legacy Cube, as something a little bit closer to Constructed than it is to an actual game of Limited. And I just like Limited. So I'm definitely leaning in that direction, and having these kinds of cards that can give you that kind of gameplay is just really appealing to me. What I have definitely tried to do is try and choose as many of these kind of modal spells as possible. So Feat of Resistance is a great example where it is clearly a combat trick that also is very strong at just foiling a removal spell or, allowing you to get the extra damage through that you need to through protection. A lot of the adventure combat tricks serve a similar role.
Those are
where
great, yeah.
They can be a combat trick, but also they just you don't have this problem of having an AB mechanic where sometimes they just are dead cards. And I also really, related to this, is that I do have a couple colors that have the heroic mechanic, and I think it would be really easy to look at this cube, and maybe it's a fair criticism, but you could make the criticism that, oh, this is just a cute synergy cube, and I'm just going to, draft all the signets and the gold cards and wreck everybody who's trying to do cute synergies. But a lot of the, heroic, I think, is actually a much more open mechanic than I think people give it credit, where there are all these divided burn spells. You have cards like Ardenvale Tactician that you traditionally tap your opponent's creature, but it is an instant. You can use it on your own creatures. So it just gives you a ton of opportunities to interact in combat. What could be more open mechanic than just targeting your creatures?
Yeah,
I guess.
And I think my reticence to move in on the heroic deck is that you're definitely right about all that. And that is very appealing from a game designer hat perspective, right? There are a lot of incidental overlaps with other mechanics.
Sorry, let me get my other hat.
Right. So, I mean, if that's the hat we have on, I totally get how rewarding it is to be able to have, all these spells that interact in these ways. And I agree, targeting your own creatures means that it unlocks a lot of other cards to become valuable that otherwise would be, whatever, or have a good baseline value, but now have additional value because of the sort of heroic stuff. I guess what it comes down to is, whenever there is any kind of synergy deck that is also the aggressive deck, it makes me a little skeptical because that if you're the one that's trying to win on tempo and be proactive, then you're the one that basically can't let your cards be drawn in the wrong order, can't stumble on not being able to curve out or whatever, because that's how you're playing to win the game, right? The heroic synergy is never going to be able to go toe to toe with the blink synergy in terms of just raw value, and just we go to turn 12 and my heroic stuff was that much better that I beat your blink stuff. At least that's my evaluation of it. It feels like some of the synergies are long game synergies that generate a bunch of value, and some of them are just kind of icing on the top, or if you already had a great curve out, now your curve out is just 10% better because of these heroic interactions, whereas actually just playing a 1-drop into a 2-drop into a combat trick was going to be enough no matter what, and now you did it into a combat trick and you got another token or whatever, and it feels cool, but it didn't actually help your deck, and you introduced the possibility of now you just draw all combat tricks and your hand doesn't do anything or whatever.
Well, I would disagree with that to some degree, in that I think a lot of those synergistic mechanics are not just about, winning more and getting on the board more. They actually just give those decks a lot more reach. So my hope, and I might not be succeeding here, is that if you're drafting one of these 2-color aggressive decks in the Naya colors, these mechanics just give you an opportunity to actually win the game rather than just stalling out because the environment is a little bit slowed down.
It's possible. Yeah, I haven't done it much because that is what keeps me from... That is the sort of, siren that goes off in my head whenever I see stuff that's questionable on its own, but would be good in a heroic synergy deck, and I'm like, ugh, is that where you want for my 2-drops in my aggro deck? It just feels like a liability. That is the bias I have that changes my fundamental card evaluation, that makes me never feel like that's what I'm supposed to be drafting until I get to the very end of the draft, and I'm like, oh, look at all these Boros aggro cards that wield to me the entire time.
There's Feather, pick 14.
Right, and that's that's actually what's happening, right? And it's not that I am saying I think this deck is bad consciously. I'm gonna refuse to draft it. I'm gonna turn my nose up at it. It's that I'm looking at a pack, and because of my biases and card evaluations, I just don't feel like it's open. I don't feel like these are cards that it doesn't feel like a high pick to put one of those cards in my deck, when in actuality it might be if I'm just not understanding that archetype perfectly. So.
Admittedly, it is a lot of these interactions are higher variance than others. Even with these sort of mitigating factors of adventures and modal spells, you still do need things to come together, right? I would disagree that they are higher variance than some other kinds of cards people like to play, like Moxen and Black Lotus, but it still is a degree of variance, and I think it's worth thinking about that aspect of it and whether or not you enjoy that variance.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. The one thought I had about combat tricks, just ruminating on them a little more, I like the idea that combat tricks could represent this unknown factor that would change how you might attack or block, right? For a long time in my cube, there were literally nothing you could describe as a combat trick. No instant speed way to change the stats of a creature mid-combat. These days, I do have a couple, mostly because of the adventure cards that got printed, like Rimrock Knight, which are, very flexible on their own, but also provide, just an extra combat trick if you want it. So there's very, very few of them. So I don't love the fact that in my cube, combat is, more cut and dry, right? You can't really bluff a combat trick in my cube, which is a fun part of limited Magic. You throw a cheap 2/2 into their high value 3/2 that has a cool ability, and it's well, that person knows I am not likely to want to trade, therefore this would be a good opportunity to bluff, and you get to play that like a mind game. I think it's a fun part of Magic. I think one thing that gets me about an environment like this as compared to a limited environment, and there are a couple limited environments I got to know very well because I played them enough. Ones like Amonkhet, but mostly ones that I prepared to play a GP at, limited formats that I played a lot. And when I played a format a lot, you started to know what to look out for, right? What kinds of untapped mana could actually represent a combat trick. You knew the suite of here are the 3 really playable combat tricks, and here's a couple of the fringe ones. You kind of knew what you were playing around. And here, unless you've memorized the whole cube list, it's very hard to know what you're actually playing around. So it feels like on the defense, you don't really have any options. It's well, I could be playing around nothing, or I could be playing around some spell I can't even think of. There's just so many things to imagine that I feel like that element is missing in a cube environment like this, unless, of course, you play it enough that you start to learn all those details.
That's entirely true. And honestly, that's part of a broader thing that I've been struggling with a little bit since this last draft and some of the discussion that we had, which is I'm really coming to terms with some of the disadvantages to lowering the power level. I think a lot of the advantages are pretty clear, if uninteresting to people, where, if you're just trying to design the most powerful cube again, that there's some degree of consensus about what those cards are, and you're just going to end up with the same cube. So if you're fortunate enough to already have access to that, designing a lower powered cube just gives you more options.
And not to
importantly,
overstate
not
the
just
consensus, obviously, but like certainly, if you're building a 360 card cube, it's going to have the most powerful spells. Like you're going to have Snapcaster Mage, for example. Like there are some things that are kind of just shoe-ins, and then if we spend the rest of our lives, arguing about that other 40%, right, that we like can't agree on, then that's still at the end of the day not the biggest difference. You, of course, at a lower power level, have much more control over what the decks actually do, rather than having to say, well, if I want to play the most powerful cards, then I'm going to be running all these counter spells, all these removal spells, all these mana dorks. Like it kind of does price you into certain archetypes you may not want to support.
Right. And it's not just that when we bump down the power level, we now have, the one tier 2 cube. Because of just the nature of the way cards are designed in the history of the game, the peak cards are really, really outliers. Like there's a very small pointy peak. But when you get into sort of the middle tier of cards, there's a huge range. Like there's been one lightning bolt, and don't tweet at me. But at 3 mana, we have dozens and dozens of all kinds of interesting variations of interesting burn spells. So by lowering the power level, we don't just say, here's one new cube. We say, well, here's all this opportunity to design all kinds of interesting environments with different mechanics.
It's a lot more space, and I've always said I think it's way harder. Like, just way, way, way harder.
Yes.
Because when, the cube I've designed is very close to a power-optimized cube. There's a handful of cards, like actual power, and other cards I've excluded for, reasons of not liking the way the environment works. Talked about that in the last episode if you want to hear about it. But, because I am priced into those certain archetypes, right? Like, there's just, 15 ramp spells I'm going to run, right? It limits my options, therefore it limits the game designer decisions I have to make when I'm setting up the environment. It's like, all right, what are my ramp decks ramping into is what I have to decide. Not am I building a ramp deck, or am I building a +1/+1 counter deck, or am I building a green aggro deck, right?
So it constrains your creative freedom, but it also constrains opportunity for criticism, where no one can say oh, you're playing lightning bolt, you should be playing this more powerful spell. That's as good as it gets. And similarly, it sort of locks you into a kind of balance of powerful cards that already exists. Like, sure, these cards are outliers, but there still is an expectation of the way these cards play out and how strong they are. Whereas if you take the power level down a bunch of notches, you have a lot of flexibility in that you can tune any color or any archetype up or down, but you have way less precedent for how you should do that. So It takes a tremendous amount more playtesting to actually get those things to a reasonable balance. And as your players actually just get more familiar with the environment, things can just change wildly.
Yes.
So yeah, just trying to arrive at that balance without this existing construct of both what the cards actually are, and that they are somewhat balanced if you're choosing this top power level, and then also the fact that players are already coming to it with an expectation of how powerful these cards are relative to each other, which makes them much more comfortable approaching that experience.
There's also a lot to be said for other cube designers that have worked at the power optimized level, are just used to playing with the vast majority of the cards that are in consideration, and so they have better informed opinions about what those cards do. Whereas,
absolutely,
how many of us have played with Ambuscade or Ambuscade, however you pronounce this green combat trick, and can offer an opinion on that is any more than just basically conjecture based on our past experience, right? I think you're very right that not only is your job harder, but the feedback you get from people is less helpful, because you're getting feedback on all sorts of layers of things that people that are working at more higher power levels are not having to deal with. And you're also getting less informed opinions, because people played with something once and said, well, geez, I drafted this card and didn't win with it, so it feels bad. It seems like a bad card. Whereas, no one would say that if they, had lost with Lightning Bolt in their hand, right? Because everyone just knows Lightning Bolt's been around forever. It's iconic. It's it's earned its keep. So there's no discussion about that. And so you have to actually really get down to nuts and bolts about card evaluation, and what we mean when we say a card is good.
That's exactly the problematic challenge, where if an opponent loses with an open fire in their hand, they are likely to have the feeling that oh, well, if this had been Lightning Bolt, I could have won this game. And the conceit that I would like to entertain is that the actual numbers on the cards don't matter. If we just made everything cost twice as much, we would still be playing the same game, we would still be making the same decisions, and have just as much fun with them.
But what do you mean by that? Because I think if you double the cost on everything, the game would change dramatically.
Oh, you're no fun. Can't we have a minute?
Well, I'm just trying to get at what you mean before we get all the tweets and Reddit comments, right? Because, like, if you double the cost of everything, unless you also doubled your opening hand size or whatever, like, you're changing fundamental mechanics of the game, now all of a sudden 4-drops are uncastable because you're never getting to 8. So we're just talking about, shades of 1, 2, and 3 drops, aka 2, 4, and 6 drops.
Right. I mean, if we literally took just mana costs and said, well, every land taps for 2, every card costs twice as much, like, there's no difference.
Oh, sure, okay. Sure.
I mean, maybe if we took it to another extreme, like, I don't think Lightning Bolt is more fun than Ambuscade, and, sorry, not Ambuscade, Open Fire. And this is where I really want to put on my designer hat and say, like, we're not trying to play the most powerful cards. We're trying to create cards that are in balance, that interact with each other in an interesting way.
Right.
So if we imagine the people that are actually at Wizards of the Coast designing cards, if they're sitting there like, well, I gotta design a black 4/4. How much should that cost? I guess 5? No way, it should cost 1, because that's way more fun. Like, a more efficient card is more fun. But, like, the game would just immediately break down. Like, that doesn't make sense at all, right?
Right, and I mean, at Wizards, for people that don't listen to drive to work, right, like, design and development are actually separate tasks at Wizards, right? So the people that are actually coming up with the mechanics of cards, the themes, the sort of designing the set, are not the ones that are directly responsible for deciding how much mana cost actually goes on the card at the end of the day, because that's the job of development when they're trying to make sure that nothing's been broken in some eternal format or whatever. So these are separate concerns at Wizards too, and yet they're not. We don't think of them as separate concerns as Cube designers.
Right, and I mean, even more, if we want to talk about the way that cards are designed, when they are doing early testing, they just choose a totally even flat power level, cost everything, so everything is playable, everything is fine. And they really try and play the mechanics to figure out what is fun and interesting. And then they hand it off to, I guess what's called play design now. And their job is not just to cost things so they're balanced, but especially to cost things so that the things which are fun are also the things which are effective, so that you will, by trying to win, do the fun thing, do the, flavorful, mechanical, unique thing about a particular set.
This is why we don't get Winter Orb anymore.
So I think that if we are willing to buy into that conceit to some degree, we can see there's a little bit of crosstalk between when somebody says, like, I'm designing a cube, which of these 2 cards, an Open Fire or Lightning Bolt, should I put into the cube? If you say, well, put in the better one, you might be meaning, like, Lightning Bolt is better because it is a more efficient card, it's more powerful and constructed, but neither is actually better in the actual environment if everything is balanced around it. The problem that I've been realizing is that crosstalk also affects players just as much, and the fact that players have an emotional reaction to, I've cast Lightning Bolt and won a lot of games, I've had Open Fire in my hand and not been able to cast it and lost a lot of games, that, like, emotional attachment to cards is entirely reasonable, and the fact that they also just don't have as much experience in how to evaluate these cards in different contexts is, to me, it seems largely like a fun thing. Like, I love approaching a limited environment and trying to figure out what is effective in this specific context, even when you have reprints.
Right.
But it's hard, and it might just be more work than people are interested. Like, there might just not be as much fun doing that compared to how much effort it is than just playing the, high-powered cube with the cards people are familiar with.
Well, I think invested Magic players, I think if there's one thing I've noticed about Magic players, it's that there is a pretty consistent, like, curiosity. Like, a lot of people find that, like, new frontier of here's a new set, let's figure out what's good, fun. Because that's a lot of what Magic is, right? Like, just new combinations of these same things we've seen over and over again, and, like, how does combining them in new ways change what's effective or whatever. I think that, to some degree, like, one fact is that, powerful cube environments are not solved, so it's not like they're sitting down to play that because they know everything about it. And I think even drafting, a very typical cube with all the sort of, normal host of cards that everyone always plays, it doesn't mean that you sit down and have no decisions to make and just think, well, I know exactly how these cards are ranked. I got my pick order. I, can figure out what's open very easily. And so, like, that same exploration is happening even when people know all the cards and are familiar with them. But you're definitely right. There is, like, that emotional attachment to powerful cards, which win you games, that people don't have to less powerful cards that don't win them games, even if, like you said, in the abstract, there's nothing saying that Open Fire is any less exciting than Lightning Bolt, right? In fact, it may be better because it doesn't, tilt the environment and have Lightning Bolt be dramatically undercosted, which, by modern development standards, Lightning Bolt is too good. They shouldn't print it. So So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, I think.
So it's a difficult challenge to figure out how much is it actually worth it to create this sort of different context where cards play out in different ways, and it can just be misleading and confusing in a way that's not fun. But obviously, like we said, on the other hand, you get opportunities to explore a lot more different contexts.
I think it's definitely worth it for what it's worth. I mean, don't get discouraged by 7 other cube designers drafting your cube and then giving you their hot takes about it, because for all the reasons we already mentioned, right? Like it's a complicated environment. It's hard to sort of make sense of. So I think it's always worth exploring that territory and figuring out how things play. So I'm excited to keep playing the cube, and I'm excited for you to keep refining it and better realizing your vision for it, because I think every time you make a change to it, it gets closer and closer to that what you're trying to accomplish with it, which is very, very satisfying to watch.
I do think my sort of shift in thinking about the way I include especially rares is helping, where I didn't want to initially create specifically a peasant cube with only uncommons or lower, because there are just certain effects which don't exist there, which I think are interesting and can be balanced. Mm-hmm. But switching to thinking about gameplay where there aren't these like runaway card advantage engines that just make the rest of the game meaningless, that it's mostly you're trying to draft 2-for-1s and good removal and like ways to get card advantage, and like that card advantage is a scarce resource you have to seek out. So I think cutting a lot of those cards is helping it feel more like a peasant environment, while not holding those rigid restrictions still lets us play things that are, this is this one like 3-color splashy mythic that if you can build a mana base to support it, can pay you off, and that's like a fun interplay. Or you can still have Wraths, which is a symmetrical effect that you can build around.
Yeah, I mean, I love that Kess is good in this environment, because I think in power optimized environments she's not worth the 3 colors, but here she is noticeably better at cost to other cards in different colors and different color combinations, so it's a reason to be in 3 colors, and it's very cool to watch you pull it off, because that's one of the best things about this environment, is that you can actually have those 3-color cards that are worth going out on a limb for.
And I recently added Rune as well, which I'm a little scared of, but we'll see. I hope it's there for someone. I had a chance
to maybe take Rune in a pack, and I didn't, and I can't remember what else I took, but hindsight, I wish I'd had him.
I think it's a little more of a build around, but I think it's pretty strong.
Yeah, I mean, even on his own, like again, 5 mana, 4/4 Vigilance Trample, that's just a Batterskull.
Not bad.
Just a Batterskull with Trample. And then Gravy on top. We are joined by the one and only John Terrell of Cultic Cube, the YouTube channel that I'm sure anybody listening to this podcast, if you are not familiar with Cultic Cube, I truly email me and tell me how you found this podcast, because I don't know how you could have possibly been aware of our work and not been aware of John's work over at Cultic Cube, where you make great YouTube videos all about how to design and play Cube. And welcome to the show, John.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm delighted.
First guest, a high bar. You get to set the bar for future guests and establish the tone of how we handle this. So, not a lot of pressure on your shoulders there. We want to talk specifically about, you're in the midst of releasing a 4-part video series all about the data that you were able to collect from having yours and Gwen Decker of Cube Cobra's cubes on Magic Online, which is like the dream of all cube designers. I know that when I found out this was happening to you, I was like both extremely excited, extremely jealous, and also felt like I was living vicariously through you. I got to see how this cube would be out in the world, watch my favorite streamers play your cube. So you've got this data you got back from WotC, and you've been analyzing it in these videos, and we want to talk a little bit about that. So just kind of like, first of all, listener, if you have not seen these videos, I would go watch the 2 that will have been released by the time this podcast comes out, which are the first 2 episodes about the data specifically from Cultic and Decaro cubes. And then there'll be 2 more coming in the oncoming weeks. You should obviously watch those as well, because we're going to assume generally speaking, what this video series is about. We're not going to recap it here. But, John, I'm curious just to ask you, what was like the most surprising thing that you saw personally from this data you got back?
Well, there was a lot of surprising things, I think. So I had designed the Cultic Cube to have this very flat power level, as I'm sure you're well aware. And
you do have Oko in the Cultic Cube, so it can't be that flat of a power level.
Well, yeah, and Oko, in fact, was something of a surprise performer as well, actually, and we can talk about how he fit into the environment too. That's true. I had Oko. There's Jace the Mind Sculptor there. There's some very powerful cards. It is a vintage unpowered cube was sort of what we were going for here. I wanted to get away from like super duper broken stuff, so I didn't want any turn 2, turn 3 kills. I thought through the process of testing that I'd managed like a relatively flat power level across these big stages of magic interaction and gameplay, the big major macro archetypes, aggro, mid-range, control, and combo with an asterisk. And the data, so I was so anxious to get this data and see if that held up. I think it did and it didn't, and it's hard to say sometimes the extent to which it did hold up, given the kind of data that we have.
Yeah.
So on the whole, I think things worked out as I was imagining they would pretty well, but the cheaty combo sort of archetype was definitely a dog in this environment. It underperformed, performed much worse than I'd seen it performing in testing.
Do you think that the testing you did with your friends online or your local playgroup or whatever to figure out and balance the cube as you were designing it, do you feel like the data from MTGO is a more objective measure of the actual power level of the cube than the testing you did with your local playgroup? How do you reconcile those differences?
Yeah, that's tough for sure. A couple of things. This project with WotC was an on-again, off-again kind of project. So as you all are well aware, I'd been planning with a bunch of friends and colleagues this big CubeCon convention in Madison that was to have happened in late May of 2020. That did not happen.
Oh, weird. Didn't happen in late May, huh?
Did not happen.
Just like everything else.
No, yeah, nothing happened in late May, it turns out. And so we had, months before this, the convention was supposed to happen, we had gotten this deal with WotC to host a couple of our cubes. So that was super exciting. We were in early dialogue with WotC, getting their feedback about what they wanted from these cubes, because they had some real ideas about the formats that they wanted, which included, by the by, a block cube, which didn't end up happening. We talked them down from that, but we designed a Return to Ravnica, Ravnica extended block cube for it. Anyway, then COVID happened, and the whole thing just kind of fell into a shambles, and it looked like we weren't going to work with WotC anymore. And fair enough, we weren't doing CubeCon anymore, so why should WotC be hosting this thing?
Right.
But then Jonathan Brostoff, who's such a go-getter, he just kept pestering WotC, good man, Lord love him, and he got it going again somehow. So the cubes were back on again, but then all of a sudden we had like a month or something to revisit these cubes that we'd started designing in earnest and try to formalize them. So that wasn't, as you all well know, a lot of time to work on a cube. We work on these things for years, right?
Yeah, and they still suck.
That's right. Right, we're constantly tinkering and finding ways to improve.
Yeah.
And it's COVID time, as you say. Like, I don't have my... I was playing with people online, right? As a way of testing and talking with friends and colleagues like you all, talking through design issues, while also trying to maintain secrecy because, had this NDA from WotC. Anyway, all that is to say that the cube design felt rushed, for sure, and I wish I'd had a lot longer and a lot more time to test it. But I think I took a pretty good stab at it, and I was working with a lot of smart people, and I had strong ideas about what I wanted to do and how you go about doing the kinds of things that I wanted to do. I think that there are huge differences, though, between how people interact with the cube in real life or as small groups playing online, and how tens of thousands of people interacted with the cube on Modo.
Mm-hmm.
At least one huge difference is, of course, that Modo has cross-pod play.
Right.
and honestly, I don't even really know how to account for all of the changes that entails versus a typical 8-person pod. It just totally changes the, how one drafts, and it changes the meta when you can be facing actual, mirrors. So that makes a huge difference for sure. And then people go into Moto with different expectations than my friends do, especially when so many of the people working on the cube, helping me test the cube, helping me talk about the cube, are people like you, people like us, who are so very invested in cube design.
Right.
So,
very enfranchised players who do this a lot, which, I imagine people that are playing on MTGO, and drafting the cubes are probably already on the higher level tier of investment in the game. But certainly when you're spending just, frittering away the hours in cube design discords and, Reddit threads and stuff, you're a certain type of player, which is why I was curious to know how you were processing this sort of feedback. Because, my cube, and I think Anthony would probably say the same for his to some degree, like I like to think of them as being designed for an objective audience. But the reality is that they're designed for my playgroup, the people I actually play with, right? Like, I won't get the chance likely to put it in front of 20,000 people or, total strangers very often. So ultimately, like, the biases of my playgroup and the skill level of my playgroup and the experience of my playgroup is a big factor in how my cube is evaluated and tested.
Even if not designed for, it's just designed with that feedback. So, like, the kinds of things that might, or I guess a different way to say it is, there could be things that are extremely problematic that certain players don't see, and I would be terrified to put my cube in front of a giant audience, and immediately players would say, well, this is the only viable archetype, nothing else matters.
So but they would say that about every archetype, though, is the key thing about people.
Interesting.
They would say it about all the archetypes, because no one would disagree on anything. Yeah, but it's like, I would say that probably a group of cube designers are more invested, a little more experienced than the average MTGO drafter. And you could say the same thing and say, what if you had the chance to take your cube and set it down at the top 8 of a Pro Tour and put it in front of, like, the best players playing today? Like, how would they interpret the environment? And these are all, like, discrete differences. And it strikes me that, maybe this idea I have in my head of trying to design my cube for, like, an objective audience, that, like, there is a way to play the cube properly, and we're all striving for that, is something I have to, like, let go of, because it's just really, there's so much bias in how everything gets played.
Yeah, that's true. I think I don't have any evidence for this at all, but it's my theory that people approach Moto cubes with a kind of Moto mindset. They have certain expectations for what the Moto cube looks like, or what the legacy cube on Moto looks like, or the vintage cube on Moto looks like.
There's a lot of people for whom the Moto Vintage Cube is Cube. That is what Cube is. And I've seen a lot of people refer to, like, oh, what do you mean Pauper Cube? I mean, okay, I guess that's fine, but they think of Cube, the format, as the MTGO Vintage Cube.
Right.
So one of the things that I thought was most interesting about some of the analysis you were making was that you saw a lot of the really iconic sort of top performing cards actually perform much lower than you would have expected. And your hypothesis, which makes a lot of sense, is that the players that know just about those iconic cards are going to take them, whereas the players that know deeply about that archetype are going to take that, but also all the sort of secondary tier 2 cards. And I feel like that also played a lot out in sort of the, like, cheaty reanimator archetypes that you have as well, where, that just fits so perfectly with what you just described. If somebody is used to playing the vintage cube, and they see your cube where you would, like, made this really deliberate choice to power down that archetype so it actually plays in a more interactive way, which I personally think is awesome. But do you think players just then say, I'm going to draft this like the normal vintage cube, and if I see a 4-mana reanimation spell, that's just nothing to me?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible, for sure.
Wait, anecdotally, I saw exactly that from a streamer that I watched. They were drafting a reanimator deck, and they were like, well, I'm not going to take these 4-mana reanimation spells. I'll get the better ones, later on or something. And then they just had a pile that was like, well, and I think that's a really important thing to note. Like, aggro, not too dissimilar. I mean, obviously there's differences, but, aggro not as dissimilar in this environment in terms of specific card choice from the MTGO cube than something like, Reanimator or something, which did have cards that you very specifically included to get a density of effects that, like, a lot of people had never seen before. They had to read what Norwood Priestess did. They're like, what is this card? And a lot of people just kind of have blinders for that stuff. So, yeah, like, I feel like one of the big takeaways from the videos that you've released thus far, which is a very relevant takeaway, is that you actually can't take away that much from this because, what it really is reflecting back at you is just, the biases of the, like, aggregate player base, right? Like, it's entirely possible that, cheaty is actually the best strategy in your cube, and it's just that so many people didn't know how to play and draft it that it performed badly. And so you as a cube designer have to, like, figure out, okay, if this strategy is drafted by a player that knows what they're doing, they, crush the table every single time. It's incredible, but the vast majority of players are not doing that. And so, like, which of these is the truth? Like which is truth? Is it what most people are doing, or is it what, a skilled player can do with the right resources?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult to know, probably impossible to know. Also, of course, red deck wins. The slide deck did extremely well.
In both cubes.
Yes, right. Aggro was where you wanted to be in both cubes for sure. But also, as you will have seen from the analysis, aggro was woefully underdrafted in both cubes.
Right.
And so the Reanimator deck, I think the whole cheaty package, including Reanimator, it was too slow. It was too slow to combat fast aggro for sure. But this is another way.
I guess that's what I'm getting at, though. Is that your takeaway, that it was too slow, or is your takeaway more that the suite of cards included in this package just happened to be cards people didn't recognize and didn't know how to draft around?
Yeah, right. No, I take your point for sure, and I agree. So if I said something in the video, I think, in passing about how I could see the metagame shifting so that aggro might become less dominant if it were contested at the draft table.
Right.
So then obviously that has cascading ramifications for other archetypes, including cheat, which all of a sudden might no longer be too slow if aggro has become slower outside of nut draws when not all of the pieces come together every time. So that's certainly possible. I do think, though, that for the cheat stuff was tuned to about 4 CMC, and I think it is too slow. The problem, of course, is... Excuse me.
Don't get choked up, John. It's okay. It's
okay.
Just a cube.
It's an emotional experience. There's just not that much good three mana reanimation stuff,
Right, like, a big gap between reanimate and zombify.
Yeah, I mean, I could break Singleton and put 8 necromancies in there or something, I guess, but there aren't that many 3 mana spells, apart from the creatures, who obviously are fragile and have their own problems. They're slow,
It's so hard to know, and I find myself both, you can come up with an explanation for so many of the analysis here, and there's lots of different explanations, right? So, I mean, take aggro. You could say, well, aggro's just the best in this cube. It's got the best cards, and therefore it's just like the best support archetype is why I perform best. That's a possible explanation. You could say what you noted, which is that it's underdrafted, therefore, if there's exactly one aggro drafter at every table, they're not only getting all the cards of their color, but they're getting all the colorless cards, all the best payoffs, and they just get a higher quality deck than anybody else because the meta hadn't shifted. You could also say that aggro is just inherently a archetype about consistency, and therefore any aggressive deck is just going to lose less games to variance. It's going to lose less games to drawing nothing but cheat targets and no cheat spells. It's going to lose less games to all of the inherent, stuff in the air about Magic that would in the long run give it sort of an edge over any sort of more fragile strategy. Any of those could be true, and so it sounds like you are at least resolved. So you have an opportunity, obviously. Who knows when we will not be under the sort of thrall of COVID and we actually get to have CubeCon. You have an opportunity to modify this cube before then, and it sounds like maybe you're planning on improving the cheat package. Is there any other conclusions you feel like you've drawn from this data that you think you can actually kind of see through all this bias and actually come to some conclusion that you're comfortable taking action on?
Well, I think, just to continue with cheat for a moment, another option, of course, is to cut the cheat package entirely. Just go through and pull it out of every single color. And I tried to make it available in every color. It's harder in white. There's Resurrection. But every other color has opportunities for this.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that could come out, and then that would make more space for example, a still more robust green mid-range package, which could have performed better. It wasn't awful, but it could have done better. I sort of expected it to do a little better than it did, as a foil to aggro, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But this is another place where I know how to build the build the deck that I want people to build, and other people aren't going to see this deck necessarily when they're not used to seeing it and not used to drafting green in this particular way.
Yeah, people looking just for super ramp are like, give me Eldrazi, give me Cradle and Ruffellos and Thran Dynamo, and let me play 10 drops. And that's not your vision for green. Like you said, it's not a thing I think most players are familiar with and know how to do. Honestly, it's the kind of thing where I wouldn't be surprised if less experienced or players less exposed to Cube would be more likely to draft that kind of deck, because they're like, well, this seems like a really good limited draft deck, and I'll just take these great 5-mana creatures and planeswalkers and crush my opponent swiftly.
Whereas that's certainly how I drafted Cube the first time, and I drafted exactly the green-black pile that everyone said I would.
Yeah, right.
But you had so many good removal spells, Anthony.
And they had no targets.
So anyway, are there any other conclusions you feel like you've drawn from this that are actually informing changes to the Cube directly?
I'll keep thinking about aggro. I think I might cut the aggro 1-drop creature package a little bit, but probably not a great deal. Like 1 or 2 1-drops could come out of red and white. Maybe. I've got to keep mulling it over. That was something that had been calibrated through not only testing, but also, math, right? I know this is sort of a hotly contested topic, but I did hypergeometric analysis on all sorts of elements of the cube, of course, because I wanted to make sure that archetypes weren't traps. And I can understand, I've got more sympathy, I guess, now for wizards pulling back over time on support for aggressive strategies. When I see in this cube aggro having such robust support and having such a strong showing, and yet people continue to underdraft it, then I'm sympathetic to the argument that people are loath. Some people, many people, may be loath to draft aggro. They don't like the fun police kind of thing. They don't like playing against it. They don't like drafting it. I don't know what the issue is exactly, how people feel about it. But Wizards, many of us complain about this, right? Wizards, it seems like every year we get a new vintage cube or whatever, and they remove a couple more aggro 1-drops until I feel like these archetypes are honestly a trap, and you really have to get the perfect pool of cards and have no competition at the table in order to draft a really good, white weenie deck or whatever in the Moto Vintage Cube. Mm-hmm. I didn't want that to be the case here. I wanted that to be available if you want to go into it,
So something we've talked a lot about is just sort of how a lot of people don't want to be the fun police. They don't want to draft the aggro deck because it feels maybe a little bit less interactive, a little bit less just like interesting to play through. But how important that having that archetype at the table is, because it forces everyone else to be more responsible. It actually makes your choices between, like, should I value fixing versus early interaction, like real choices, because you might face that aggressive deck. So do you think it's worth it just to say, like, aggro's not really a thing, everyone just have fun and draft these kinds of decks you want? Or
right. I don't want that. I kind of hate that personally.
Right.
That's just not the environment that I want to play. And I think, this is me acting in this sort of oracular mode and telling people what I think that they should want, being a cube fascist. But I feel like, honestly, many people may think that they want the mid-range, all the time pile of sweet stuff, and I think that's cool from time to time, but I don't feel like that's what a lot of Magic players actually want on a sort of day-to-day basis, any more than Vintage Cube, honestly, is a thing that I think most people want on a day-to-day basis. It's sweet to, play your Moxen and so on. And maybe I have this totally wrong, and this is just entirely me, but...
So I was going to say something similar about aggro specifically, which is that obviously people don't like to play against aggro, especially when they drafted their greedy deck that they're trying to do all their sweet stuff, and they're not allowed to because they just get beat down by a 2-1 or whatever. But I think there's a lot of knock-on effects to an environment where there really is no aggro that people would say they wouldn't want and might not attribute to the presence or absence of aggro. where they're like, somebody was posting on the Reddit today and said, like, all of my games take an hour. And it's like, well, there's ways you can stop that from happening, and it's give people ways to kill people on like turn 5 instead of turn 20 or whatever. So, there's things that people end up complaining about and not liking about Magic that are oftentimes, I think, a byproduct of that, even if it's not the actual thing, right? Like I love aggro. I didn't when I first got into Magic, but I'm a big convert, and I really enjoy trying to make just the right efficient deck, and just get my opponent just barely dead before they can turn the corner, and balance those scales perfectly. But for some people, I think it's a necessary evil. It's like, if you don't like it, fine, but you don't want to live in a world where these decks get to run unfettered, because it's different. It's weird.
I mean, is that theoretical all mid-range environment even possible? I feel like the biggest risk is when everything's mid-range, then the only actual viable way to play is just control. And then it just turns into a weird 5-color control mishmash.
And you could theoretically then balance that and say, okay, well, if control's too good, let's take away all of control's good cards too. And then you like the closest thing to like a mid-range slogfest to me is like most sealed. It just ends up being that like you're not going to get an aggressive pool in sealed just because you only get so many cards in each color. You usually end up playing 3 colors or whatever. You're also not going to get these incredible control cards for the most part, unless you do, in which case you're very lucky. And instead, it's like, all right, who got better cards? Who can cast their better cards? Who's going to have like the deck that plays out better? And we've talked on the show. I love sealed. I think it's very skill testing. I think building a pool is really hard. None of this is a slag against sealed, but I think that's the closest thing that people have to like an environment where aggro is truly basically not present. Like it's very difficult to have a sealed deck full of 1 and 2 drops.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder if you all. I know you all have watched the videos that we've put out so far and done some reading. Is there anything that has been particularly surprising, in the results that we've seen so far about the cubes?
The one thing that stood out is just what I already mentioned about how cards that seem like the most iconic, powerful cards ended up just underperforming. It makes a lot of sense. So especially with sort of your hypothesis behind it, but it definitely stands out.
Yeah.
The one that really jumped out to me, I mentioned on Twitter, which is that in your cube, John, the 2 lowest win percentage lands were Mana Confluence and City of Brass. Which
that's also surprising.
Was striking for a couple of reasons. Like, one, the fact that they were both there and they were both, next to each other and at the very bottom implies to me that, like, there is, to some degree, like, just variance and noise has been removed. Because these cards that are functionally almost identical ended up at almost the exact same ranking, which to me is very relevant and means that there's something behind it. And then the other thing that's shocking about it is, obviously, I think these cards are incredible. I think they're really, really good. And did not expect them to be so low. So, like, to talk through some of my thoughts about it, I would have expected the dual lands from the lowest winning deck to be the lowest ranked lands.
Yeah, the other low land was like a green-black land of some sort, I think.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? Like a
Hissing Quagmire, I think.
Oh, yeah, right. So that sort of makes sense, because some, like, green base pile was probably the worst thing you could be doing in the cube.
Well, something Jet has pointed out, and Jet has an article on our own website, to plug our own website briefly, which describes how he himself analyzes his own drafts of his own cube. Obviously, we're not talking about the size of data that you have access to, but he has different kind of data for his own cube. And really, like, if you read his whole big article, which is a great article, everyone should read it. I think it's very helpful, like, companion piece to the videos you have, John, as well. Yeah. But to me, the biggest takeaway from that entire article is just that if you're looking at win percentage of cards, really it's only indicative of win percentage of decks, right? Like, the strongest factor is just how winning are the decks, and you can't look at the difference between Jackal Pup and Goblin Guide and say, like, well, this accounts for a difference in these cards, because all that matters is that the red aggressive deck is very good, so any card that's good in that deck is going to be highly ranked. Yeah. So for that reason, I expected the lands that really only go in a specific color pair, or I guess if you're playing 3 colors or whatever and splashing, to be the ones that rank the lowest. The 5 color lanes being the lowest is very strange to me, because you would expect they'd be played in decks of every color pair, which would put them kind of like right in the median of power level on their own. And so then we're left with this question of, they deal damage to you, and is that more relevant than I've always thought it was?
Or maybe here's a different hypothesis. Maybe the players that are drafting sort of a pretty sophisticated, pretty carefully constructed 2-color deck, they're going to take the fetch lands, they're going to take their shock lands, but the players that are taking the rainbow lands highest are the ones that are building just complete 5-color piles.
Right. That is the other hypothesis. Is just that I've got a City of Brass, therefore I will play 4 colors, which could be it. It could be entirely attributable to that. But I thought it was striking that those 2 lands were, the last one and second to last one, given that they're almost functionally identical. That was very striking to me.
I agree with you. That was striking to me too, because I love those rainbow lands. You all may have seen my video series on focus, where I'm trying to help people with a first pick strategy and then building their deck and so on. A drafting primer for Cube, and fixing is F in focus. This is thing number 1.
I can see the headline now. John from Cultic Cube advises Cube drafters to take the lowest winning percentage lands first,
leading everybody
sabotaging
astray.
all of his viewers intentionally.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a Cube sharp, and I'm out to steal everybody's pennies. So anyway, right, it surprises me too. I love these cards. I think I have no idea what the answer here is, of course, but I'm with Anthony that I suspect the rainbow lands mainly went in multicolored piles, and it may well be that people who played more than 2, maybe the people's sort of heuristic is, if I'm playing 2 colors or fewer, I don't put in a mana confluence, right? And then once I get to 3...
Yeah. I could honestly see people making that evaluation, because if they're really considering that life loss to be a cost and they think, well, my mana base is good enough, I have 2 or 3 duels. I mean, I really like watching streamers play Cube. I know a lot of Cube designers don't, and they get frustrated by watching people draft cubes and play the MTGO Cube or whatever. I think it's really interesting insight into like how people think and play the game, which I think is very valuable as a Cube designer. And one thing I've noticed a lot is people have a much higher tolerance for bad mana bases than I do in Cube, even when the fixing is abundant. And oftentimes you see a person be like, well, I already have a duel, so I don't need a second duel right now in the middle of pack 2. I will, go and get this other, playable card or a sideboard card or whatever. You know, like they're kind of like, my fixing's fine. I have a duel or 2 duels or whatever. Whereas, I try to play 2 colors in most Cube drafts, maybe splash a third, and, City of Brass is a card I'll play in any 2-color deck, 100%, no matter what. I could be full-on control, and I'll take a City of Brass, pack 1, pick 3, or pack 3, pick 1, rather. Very excited to just jam it in there. So, it could be that, because there's a lot of reasons it could be that. It's just very... Obviously, whatever it is consistent, because both those lands are down there together, wallowing in their last place position.
They are, and to be fair, they're not totally at the bottom of the pile. So let me find. I mean, it's not like their card 539 and 540.
Right, because they're just the bottom of the lands. The lands, I imagine, in general, are actually probably pretty high on the overall cards, I would have to guess.
Mana Confluence was 460 out of 540. So that's low, but that's, it's not outrageous. It's just a couple slots below Mirror Battlesphere, in case you're curious. And Pack Rat's right around there, too.
So now we know. Take Mirror Battlesphere, pack 1, pick 1 over good fixing.
And then City of Brass is approximately 15 picks, 15 ranks higher. So, they're close. And especially in Cultic, we can make comparisons like that are kind of interesting. Like there's Searing Spear, and there's Incinerate, and there's Lightning Strike. They're all of these functional reprints. I guess Incinerate's not quite, but there are identical cards. There are some identical cards in here that will be in the same ballpark, but might have, might be 30 or 40 or whatever ranks off.
Right.
I don't know what to say there is.
There's
what
a lot
there
of
is
noise.
to say about that beyond.
There's also
noise,
I honestly think that people probably pick non-lightning strikes a little lower because they're not used to seeing them as much. I
think that
Volcanic Hammer or
bias
whatever, which I mean it is sorcery, so it is actually worse. But anyway, it's interesting to me. Coincidence or not, Mana Confluence basically strictly worse than City of Brass, and it was 15 ranks lower. So you're at 1 life. You got to lightning bolt your opponent to kill them. You can't tap your Mana Confluence, but you can tap your City of Brass. So
the other thing I was a little bit curious about is how you feel the metagame evolves differently between players online versus playing in person. I feel like one of the things that I enjoy and really miss about just playing Cube and Paper is the sort of debrief and everybody laying out their decks and talking about it, and sort of I think everybody learns about the strategy. But you get such a different perspective, and I don't totally even understand what the flow of information is and where people are getting information about MTGO cubes, or if it's just sort of like people drafting in a vacuum.
I imagine the vast majority of people are not getting information about it, and
so they're getting information from what they see their opponents play. But that could be
or
that's true.
A streamer or whatever. Yeah, it's something that I like to design my cube with like a competitive mindset, in that I want to give players that are trying to optimize their win percentage as many tools as possible to do that. But it is worth noting we have to reconcile the fact that like cube is not a competitive format 99% of the time. A lot of people jump over here to their MTGO cube queues because they're tired of grinding standard. They don't want to play for stakes anymore. They just want to have fun, and people will basically force things they like or whatever. So like the fact that there is no reporting on the metagame, for example. Like, imagine if we invented a new constructed format like Pioneer, and, nobody was allowed to test decks or share their deck tech or whatever, and we just had a tournament and said, all right, everybody, you had a card pool, go build the best deck you can. It's totally blind. It would be, kind of madness. It'd be like pandemonium. And that's almost what every
describing
Cube
original Magic.
Yeah.
This is the Wild West, and this is what's great about Cube.
Yeah,
that is kind of true, and that's almost what every Cube draft is. Because to your point, John, there wasn't really time for the meta to shift, right? And even if we could, send a 2-minute video of you describing the successful archetypes, and force every drafter to watch it before they're allowed to queue again for the Cube. How many people are going to care? Are they going to be like, great, aggro's good. I don't want to play aggro. I don't come to Cube to play aggro. I come to Cube because I want to play my 5-color Super Friends. I don't actually know the answer to that question, but it strikes me that, we've really never had like a limited environment drafted like a Cube that has had time to develop a proper competitive meta where it's been like vetted, even to like, 1/100th the amount that a regular limited set is vetted, right, by actual drafting of people.
Yeah, but WotC has all of this information and more. We got some redacted version of their information, which is amazing. I mean, amazing, right? We've got pages and pages in Excel spreadsheets. It's super cool. I'm so thankful for it. But, they've told me we've like weeded out some of the data. This has been filtered.
It's like, why'd you bother doing that?
Yeah.
Why'd you spend time making this less useful to me?
Right. And they still don't want it shared publicly, but thank goodness they're, allowing us to share it. So good on them. But, right, WotC can iterate on Vintage or Legacy Cube on Moto, and you would think they've got amazing tools at their disposal and great thinkers of Magic, obviously, to help them with this iteration. That's part of what can be frustrating to cube designers sometimes, when we feel like they're making choices that don't make tons of sense to us necessarily. But I tried to give people tools before they went into these formats.
Right.
You know me, I produce content. So I wrote an article for WotC, for the Mothership, and I made a video, and Gwen and I talked on the Chateau Cube podcast, and JJ of Cube Outside the Box interviewed me when this thing was getting rolling. So this was there's a lot of information for people, but I totally get it. Like, this is not everybody as invested in Cube as I am, so I understand.
It's also worth noting that was information that was somewhat hypothesized, right? Like, you were like, here's what I intend, but you didn't have any data back on what actually was the reality. So like, even the MTGO Vintage Cube, right? Like, yes, presumably, I would imagine and hope that the designers of that cube are spending a lot of time fretting over all the detailed data they have about it to try and make the best decisions they can for that environment. And I have to say, a lot of cube designers will criticize the MTGO cube, which I think is really just out of place. Like, that cube has very specific design goals, which are basically make everyone love this cube, and they are very successful in that almost everybody loves that cube unless you're a super dedicated cube designer, and then you get all like crotchety about it. So I feel like people need to be more forgiving to that environment, because they do have so many factors to consider. But even with all that data they have, they don't, to my knowledge, do any reporting on the meta, right? Like, I don't feel like they get to the end of the Vintage Cube season and say, hey, here were the most successful decks and archetypes, here were the underperformers and overperformers.
No,
which would
but
be
I
what you
don't
would need to
think-
have. You would need to have that feedback
Right.
in order to let people then go back in and like adjust. And you need also an invested, player base that actually cares about optimizing their win percentage and not just having fun or whatever.
Right. I mean,
Yeah,
I think
well,
that's a huge part of the point. Is it's ultimately still a casual format. People are coming to it from other formats to have a good time. They're there,
Right.
willing to look for the fun. They're not trying to optimize their win percentage. So let's put
Yeah.
some money on this.
Yeah, it seems like it could. WotC may worry it makes it less fun, and also as well, you all know, I'm sure, back in February maybe of 2020, WotC asked Frank Karsten to stop publishing aggregated data about decks
Yeah.
and their performance at GPs or whatever we're calling GPs and so on.
Yeah.
So WotC is actually trying to sort of tamp down on the information that's public, even when it is actually publicly available. They're asking people not to aggregate it and present it in this
Yeah.
prepackaged form. So
You're like that seems like trying to stem the floodwaters with a Dixie cup to me. Like I don't it seems
Yeah.
I feel like that's a little misguided. I mean, obviously if they want to tell people to stop, they can do that, but the information is public, so it's like why do you
Yeah.
want us to willfully live in the dark, right? Like I know there's this like beautiful utopian ideal of Magic, like as it first existed, where no one knew what was in the booster packs and no one knew what was rare and uncommon and common,
Right.
and you just like
Right.
it was this exploration. But we're not in that world anymore, so that seems a little weird to me. But it is what it is.
yeah, so
None
I'm
of us are
ex-
WotC, unfortunately.
No, and I didn't expect I was going to get the data from WotC. So I'm very glad that they gave it to me. It felt like there was this trend away from making data public, so I'm very thankful that they did make that public. I guess let me say a word about Gwen's Cube too, because since I've been rattling on about the Cultic Cube so much. Gwen's Cube, super interesting results as well, of course. They're the big picture things that in some ways look similar to Cultic, as in the performance of aggro, which did quite
Mhm.
well and was underdrafted. An interesting thing about Gwen's format and the analysis that we can do of it is he has this sweet environment that has all of these different recombinatory possibilities where I'm talking about things like microarchetypes supported like aristocrats and so on. But
That
there's
have
a great-
overlap with other microarchetypes and like a lot of like ways where you can build a 3-color deck that pulls in a couple different archetypes and like combines cards in novel ways, right?
Yeah, exactly. And one-off cards like Birthing Pod, less a one-off card these days, I guess, but one that you can build around just on its own, I suppose, but also it intersects with Blink and whatever else, right? So Gwen's Cube, super cool, infinite directions to go with it. This made analysis of the environment infinitely harder than
Right.
analysis of Cultic, which is already sort of impossible, as we've discussed. Part of the point of my design here was to really limit the directions that one can go in terms of the major theaters of interaction, and then I can more easily drill down and talk about how aggro's doing, because I know where to look for aggro. It's in these particular places, But, when you can have a little bit of Blink and a little bit of Pod and a little bit of whatever, it's extremely difficult to say how Blink did or something,
Especially with the fidelity of data you had specifically, where you
Yeah.
couldn't separate blue-white control from blue-white Blink from blue-white tempo. It's just blue-white did
Yeah.
this,
Yeah. So that was super, super interesting, and it also gave me much more respect than I already had for the difficulty that WotC design has in balancing extraordinarily complex environments, whether it be a limited retail draft environment or trying to figure out standard and so on.
And trying to do
Even-
all of those at once.
Yeah, for sure. Right.
Well, John, thank you for joining us on the show. I really appreciate you coming on. I can't imagine a better first guest. And thank you for always being a champion of what we're doing over at Lucky Paper. It means a lot. So why don't you plug all your stuff? You got a wide variety of channels. Tell people where to go to find more of you and your work.
Okay, I have a YouTube channel called Cultic Cube, and this is at youtube.com/CulticCube. This is where I do the majority of my work. I started in COVID times a podcast, as we do, and that's called Chateau Cube. You can find that on all your favorite listing services, and you can
French
find me
for Cube House.
Cube House, yeah, Cube, fancy schmancy, expensive Cube House. Yeah, on various Discords and stuff, and I'm at Cultic Cube on Twitter, so definitely find me around, and I'm always delighted to chat Cube, and I'm always delighted to work with, people interested in Cube and friends in the community. I love seeing, the diversity of voices that we have in Cube design, and I'm really appreciative of you all's work. I've got a new favorite Cube podcast, so thank you so much for the work you guys are doing. It's great. And
we promise to continue to prattle on aimlessly about Cube at least until this quarantine ends,
Right.
and then who knows what will come after that. Well, thank you for tuning in to Lucky Paper Radio. We were very excited to have you here and talk about Magic, our favorite children's trading card game. If you want to follow the show, you can find us online at luckypaper.co. You can follow us on Twitter. I do have an Instagram account where I post pictures of some Magic cards every once in a while, so if you're into that, you can follow us over there at luckypapermtg. And thank you to James Nasty for our music and production. And yeah, find us on the internet. Any closing words, Anthony?
Just respect Traxos.